Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy LaRose. Today I'm going to talk about the privatization of education. In our image here, you can see literal bricks being taken away from the existing public school buildings and being used to build new private schools. This is symbolic of the government funds being taken away from the public schools and allocated to the private school system instead. So, an overview of the issue. I'm going to skip over the definition since as college students studying education at the graduate level, we likely know what all these words or terms mean, but please reference the presentation packet outline for these definitions if you are unsure. I know I had to review what economies of scale meant since it has been some years since my economics classes. Okay, so let's just start off with a brief synopsis here. Privatization is not a new concept by any means. But Milton Friedman really got the modern debate on privatization started with an essay he wrote in 1955 called The Role of Government in Education. In recent years, advocates like Chris Whittle and many more government officials had carried the torch, leading to an ever-growing, more privatized school system. Today, there are nearly 40,000 private and charter schools amongst 97,568 public schools. That is nearly half the amount of public schools. Friedman and Whittle believe that the school system can be run like a business, exposing it to the free market, making it more competitive, innovative, and driving improvement. They believe the public school system is broken, and privatization is the way to fix it and save America's education system and therefore save the nation. Thankfully, there are plenty of opponents to privatization out there. I think I already gave away my stance on this issue, but people like Henry Levin and Diane Ravitch that we heard from this week provide strong arguments in support of the public school system. They believe that the public schools have obviously fared us well over the years as America prospers and leads the world in innovation. They worry privatization will hurt children by treating them like commodities as opposed to the young people they are. Quite the debate. So let's dive in and see what is really going on. So let's take a look at the two sides. The for privatization side are from our reading, The Yes to Privatization, supporters like Chris Whittle and Milton Friedman. They want to create a competitive market-based system that moves the public service of education to the private sector. They believe the public schools of today are not innovative, are unchanging, and competition will drive results. They believe that the same business models used in industry can be applied to the education of students. They strive for less regulation and government bureaucracy and believe this can make the system more efficient. They want all students to be given vouchers of equal amounts from the government to be used for private schools, giving them a choice of which type of school they want to attend. Whittle specifically hoped to use privatization to cut costs and raise teachers' and principals' pay. And Whittle's vision specifically wants to revamp the education process by having more student-directed learning, including student-led teaching. The against privatization, or the no to privatization side, are supporters like Henry Levin and Diane Ravitch. They believe that public schools do not need a complete overhaul. Teacher training, investment in the whole child, additional funding, and various other improvements have been and continue to be driving factors for positive change in public schools. They also contend that there have always been public school critics and reformation policies. Schools cannot constantly bend to every new idea. They believe that for-profit schools benefit private investors the most. They argue that deregulation leads to decrease in teacher training and pay. They feel that privatization does not offer realistic promises. Also, they contend that there can be corruption and mismanagement of funds in corporate schools. They believe students need personal attention and smaller group learning, not treated as a number in a corporately efficient system. So what are the pros and cons to privatization? Well, to start, a potential pro to privatization would provide students with more choices. But a con would pull money away from public schools. Another pro would be it creates a competitive based system that puts more pressure on public schools to perform better and meet students' needs better. But a con to this for public schools, as regulated public schools lose more funding, they have to compete with better funded, deregulated private schools, making the playing field far more uneven. It also creates a system of winners and losers, which you don't want to see when it comes to educating children. Another pro would be to allow for less segregation that public school districting creates. And a con, private schools can become selective of students, leaving underprivileged and students with special needs behind. A pro would be students have the opportunity to leave underperforming or failing schools behind. Con, there is not enough evidence to support privatized schools can improve students academically. So they might not be doing any good anyway. Now, I want to add a disclaimer to the third pro listed here. Though the supporters of privatization contend that privatization helps to desegregate the schools, studies have found that it can achieve the opposite by stratifying into socioeconomic, ethnic, special education designations, neighborhood, and behavioral characteristics. Why? Well, for a few reasons. For one, parents tend to gravitate towards the type of schools they want their children in. For instance, rich people might want their children going to a school that has lots of might not want their children going to a school that has lots of poor individuals, or racist parents may steer clear of schools with a heavier portion of an ethnic group they don't like. And two, private schools do not face regulations and do not have to abide by IDEA. They can exclude students with disabilities if they can't care for them, don't want them, etc. So these students may find themselves more often in the public school system or in a private school that caters specifically to that disability. Another reason, private schools can be selective. They can choose to omit certain types of individuals that they may deem as undesirable for their school. The next few slides pertain to the history of privatization. I truly believe this is important because much of the debate is centered on how our schools have not improved or changed for decades, and what steps have led us to where we are today. Public schools have been scrutinized and criticized by detractors since their beginning, and as Diane Ravitch puts it, have used the schools as punching bags. History helps us to understand how and why America is moving more towards privatization in recent decades. The idea of privatization had been around for a while, but it was really laid out by an important economist named Milton Friedman in an essay he wrote in 1955 titled The Role of Government in Education, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Around this time, some privatization advocates had already begun privatizing schools in an effort to avoid desegregation, which had just been mandated a year earlier in 1954. In Friedman's essay, he applied his savvy economic principles to the subject of school and hoped that it would lead to integration by having more students migrate outside of their zip codes, specifically their urban, often poor, and often non-Caucasian districts. The 1980s really saw the Reagan presidency and neoliberals pushing for change, warning in a 1983 report titled A Nation at Risk that the nation's failing education system would have dire consequences. Standardization, testing, and school accountability were now standard fare, no pun intended. On a side note, Chile's new military dictator, Augusto Pinochet, rapidly deregulated schools around this time, after being influenced by Friedman's privatization philosophy. This would have a negative impact on Chile's education system, as teachers' salary, teachers' respect, teachers' training requirements, and student achievement levels all dropped. The 1990s really saw modern privatization of schools get their kickstart. In 1989, Milwaukee, Wisconsin legislature passed the voucher system for the school district. On the international stage, Ontario, Canada, coincidentally not terribly far from Milwaukee, and Sweden both moved towards privatization. The 2000s were kickstarted by the first PISA report, an international assessment of 15-year-old students on math, science, and literacy that tested 80 different countries. The world was surprised by Finland, who came out close to the top, and America, who fared poorly. As you can see by the bar graph depicting 7 developed countries, results from the 2000s to 2009 PISA report, the assessment is done every 3 years. So what was Finland doing right? Well, they weren't doing standardized testing, so the PISA results surprised Finland as much as the rest of the world. They also have a public school system that favors equity and highly trained teachers. Maybe we should take a note from their playbook. I mean, Chile, Sweden, and as we're about to see, Ontario's privatization seemed to make education worse. But Finland has a public school system and they are doing great. They just put more into their public education system than America does. So why are we embracing privatization so much? Well, as Ravitch explains, privatization scare tactics, great sales pitches, and negative media stories on public education seem to be leaving their mark, but I digress. Post-PISA, the US is now under pressure to fix our lagging test scores. Enter Bush's No Child Left Behind Act. Standardizing testing is mandated for 3rd graders, 8th graders, and once for high schoolers. Accountability is ramped up. Underperforming schools are addressed with either closure, state takeovers, switching over to charter schools, which increases privatization, or the hopefully less severe bucket of various other improvement measures. Now enter the Edison school explosion, as Whittle talks about in his essay, bragging that he has influence over 1,000 schools and 300,000 students. Ironically, as the US is ramping up privatization and singing its praises, our neighbor to the north, Ontario, Canada, is reverting back to a public school system. In 2003, after 3rd and 6th graders assessed had slumped down to 54% proficiency rates in math and reading, and only 2/3 of high schoolers graduating. In 2009, Obama's program Race to the Top follows the Bush drumroll march, maintaining standardized testing, holding schools accountable, and possibly turning underperforming schools into charters. So what happened to Edison schools? This is exactly what Larry Cuban set out to find in his 2020 article, What Happened to the Edison Schools? How did Whittle's plan that he so eloquently laid out in 2006 from our reading this week play out? Well, 2003 was the height. At that point, he was running 133 schools and 80,000 students. But problems arose that we will look at in a moment that forced him out of the school management business and into more of a school consultant type role. As mentioned in the previous slide, by 2006, Whittle boasted he had at least some level of influence over 1,000 schools and 300,000 students. Edison Schools today is known as Edison Learning, reflecting the predominantly consultant business. Around 2003, the company had begun to experience problems. As Henry Levin mentions in the article we read this week, $600 million went missing. I'll repeat that, $600 million. I can't imagine that made his investors too happy or future investors very confident. The company went from a publicly traded stock to private investment. On top of this, many school districts began to pull out, citing a multitude of reasons, like unhappiness with the academic progress students were making, or maybe I should say weren't making. Teachers' unions were putting pressure to bail out, and the public was pushing away the schools. As of 2019, only 8 schools remained, and they consisted of 2 credit recovery schools in Ohio and 6 alternative schools in Florida. Though in 2019, Edison apparently wanted to get back to his roots, if you will, and opened up 1 private school in Washington, D.C. Today, after numerous inconclusive and mixed studies that we will look at in a bit, and after the failure of Edison's schools, the debate still rages on. So let's look at some important questions lingering over this debate. So how and why are we moving towards privatization? Well, we have examined this a little bit already. We've seen the history leading us up to this point. Government actions like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top have ushered in more privatization. And we've seen the why behind these programs being implemented. Things like dire government warnings on the failings of our schools, the piece of reports, etc. This is coupled with advocates for privatization making compelling cases and using scare tactics to persuade the public that privatization is our best option. Or as Diana Ravitch put it, a skillful public relations campaign that drummed in the message over and over again that our public schools are failures, that these failures harm our children and threaten our nation's future prosperity. Ravitch, page 8. People feel they have no other alternative but to embrace privatization. And lastly, we have a government that highly values standardized test scores, and specific assessments like PISA have indicated over the last decade or more that, well, America still needs to improve their education system. Another important question we, and especially government officials, need to ask ourselves is, does privatization work? Or for our government, who so highly values academic assessments, does privatization provide students with a better education? Believe it or not, I had a hard time finding studies with definite clarity on this. Many news outlets, though, did publish articles on a study that was done in 2018 and published by Sage Journals that leaned towards private schools not working. The article I pulled was from the Washington Post, and you can find it through the link here. I used over the words Washington Post. The Sage Journal report is also linked, but it basically says low socioeconomic students or poor urban districts did not benefit from private schools. Children supposedly the most in need of the voucher system. Other students either have mixed results, still other purport privatization is beneficial, while others say it is not. Aside from the Sage Journal published longitudinal study from 2018, I couldn't find any credible or conclusive data out there. Maybe several days of research, statistical mapping, data compiling would lead me to a better answer, but I have a degree in English, not math or science. There's my disclaimer, moving on. So should and can education be treated as a business model? Well, I imagine if you asked Diane Ravitch, she would say, absolutely not. And if you asked Henry Levin, he would say less emphatically, no. Ravitch would contend that children and education are not commodities. Education is a public service and not a free market industry. As Ravitch writes, the privatization agenda excites the interest of entrepreneurs who see it as a golden opportunity to make money, but it is bad for our society. It undermines the sense of collective responsibility for collective needs. Ravitch, page 5. Levin explains how advocates of privatization see the business model saving schools. As he says, business enterprise efficiency would rescue the schools through organizational improvements, selective training, assessing and rewarding of principals and teachers on the basis of performance, and adoption of promising educational technologies. Levin, page 8. Levin also goes on to explain his point of view that even if schools are treated as a business model, there would be few opportunities for economies of scale in education because most of the costs increase with enrollments are not fixed costs that decline with additional clients. Levin, page 9. Research also has shown that students benefit greater from reduced class sizes. So are public schools fundamentally broken? In Ravitch's article, she quoted Melinda Gates saying that schools are fundamentally broken. On a side note, I also want to address the rest of what Gates said in that complete quote. Gates said, if you look back a decade ago when we started into this work, there wasn't even a conversation across the nation about the fact that our schools were broken, fundamentally broken. I guess Gates was living under a rock in the 1980s because, as we just learned from our history, this broken public school system line had been a staple of the Reagan administration. And I guess the PISA report went unnoticed and No Child Left Behind was issued just for fun. But okay, yeah. Ravish also points to the history surrounding this rhetoric and how school systems have been on the defense for forever. So yes, the question of are our schools being fundamentally broken has been an ongoing concern for critics of public schools. But are they really broken? When Levin and Ravitch, on the other hand, contend that American public schools have been churning out educated citizens for decades, centuries even. High school graduation rates have increased, as well as college enrollment rates. And if students of public schools were not receiving a high quality education, how have we been a successful, innovative nation that leads the world in many industries? How would public educated high schoolers succeed in college as so many do? A system cannot be fundamentally broken if it's working, at least to a higher degree. It just needs improvements. Levin outlines ways to increase high school graduation rates and how that can be used to add more funds to the tax system. Countries like Finland provide evidence that backing off of standardized testing requirements and therefore the curriculum designed for these tests, as well as providing more equity in teacher training, can really make a difference. Okay, we're nearing the end. Thanks for hanging in there with me on this important and hot topic. As I mentioned in slide 2, but just to refresh your memory, there are nearly 40,000 private schools, including charter schools, and 97,568 public schools. Private are nearly half that of public schools, making for nearly a third of all schools, if my math is correct. So there is a link under the words interactive map. If you click on it, it will bring you to Fordham Institute's America's Charters School Deserts page. If you scroll down just a bit, you can come to an interactive map. I've left instructions on the best steps to find the closest school near you in the presentation packet outline. If you wouldn't mind putting which type of school you found was the closest to you on the map after entering in your full address. I don't need your address or anything, just what type of school, and put it in the bottom of your presentation comments. If not, no worries, but I think it would be interesting to see what the ratio for private, charter, and public schools are, just by doing a quick survey of our class. So, what are my concluding thoughts? I'm sure my stance is quite obvious at this point, but I think that though school choice appears to be beneficial, it can end up hurting many children that cannot get into the sorry, there goes my dog. There's another dog outside. Anyway, those schools, stop Suki. Privatization through government vouchers funnels money away from public schools, giving private institutions more power. These unregulated schools can reduce teaching staff, training requirements, making teachers and therefore education less effective. They also can exclude the most needy of the population. Private schools are driven by profits and therefore tend to put stakeholders as their first priority in doing so. Results are data-driven and the focus falls on the achievement of standardized tests and not on the education of the whole student, student-teaching relationships, and student support. Students learn best when in a supportive environment where the whole student is taught. Students are our nation's youngest and most vulnerable group and should not be treated as a commodity that can be subject to the free market. As my voice is going, perfect timing. So Thank you for taking this journey with me. I look forward to all of your questions, comments, and hopefully your school's closest to you. Bye for now. Thanks.